This video is sponsored by Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Recently, I was playing some 40k with a buddy of mine, and he broke out his Space Marine army, and they were black and yellow, and for a moment I thought they were the Marines Malevolent, but it turns out I had the colors inverted. They were actually the Scythes of the Emperor, and they looked pretty cool. Now, I had seen this color scheme kicking around the internet, but I had never seen it in person, and in person, it really made me want to try it out for myself. Cracking into an Assault Marine box, a classic intercessor training the art of the chain blade will be the perfect thing for the Scythes of the Emperor, a very brutal chapter of Space Marines. I got this fella all cleaned up. The Assault Intercessor kit is actually a little different from the regular Bolter Intercessors. The legs are only 2 pieces instead of the 4 or 5 from the standard Intercessors. I like Intercessors in the tabletop game, but you know where they're also a lot of fun? In today's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is the go-to mobile game when you need to scratch that itch for a good tactics game. The battles are fun to play out and strategize for, and do I even need to say that it has all the fun Warhammer 40,000 goodness? They have so many of the factions to choose from, over 18, and out of those 18, there are over 80 different champions to pick and choose to fight in your Tacticus teams. I love that I get to use units and champions from the factions I really love. Black Templar, Necrons, Orcs, even the Death Guard. Not only that, but there are so many kinds of battles I can take them into. Huge PvE campaigns, PvP guild raids, event battles, and so much more. For the month of August, they're having a big event for the 3rd anniversary of Tacticus. And what better way to celebrate that than with the introduction of an all-new faction, the Emperor's Children. They're all about fast, hard-hitting abilities that are sure to keep your opponents guessing. Starting off with the legendary event where you can unlock Lucius the Eternal. This is one faction you're not going to want to miss out on. If you want to get in on playing the game, you can click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started today. It's free to play and a great game to play every day. For my Scythes of the Emperor, I want his colors to really shine through, so I carved off the wings of his Imperialis, leaving behind the little skull in the middle. I carefully slid my blade under the wings, wiggling it back and forth until they popped off. Then I scraped and sanded these spots to get them nice and smooth. A few times I've done this, I've accidentally sliced the skull off too, but now I've got the hang of it. For his bolter, I drilled out the barrel, and I have found this pointed Dremel bit really handy for this. It reams out the plastic really quickly and makes the hole bigger. I've actually never found a use for it in my Dremel because the tip doesn't cut, only the sides, so I don't know what a woodworker would use this for, but I usually leave it in one of my hand drills. I found a pistol hand I like the pose of, but the angle was slightly wrong. I grabbed some styrene sheet and my hole punch. This is for leather, but in a pinch, and with a lot of force, it will bite through plastic, and I made myself a little circle. I glued this onto his torso, and then used a nail file to sand down the peg on an angle so I could have his pistol arm in exactly the pose I want. Another drop of super glue, and he's ready to blast. Then for the chainsword arm, I found an arm that was held low at the ready, like he's scanning the battlefield looking for his next target. And speaking of scanning, because of the color scheme, it'll make it slightly easier to paint if I do the head and backpack separately. So I stuck these down to a little cube of wood with some double stick tape. Now to finish him off, I gave him some shoulders. The Assault Marines have one standard shoulder and then a unique one with a high edge that's for the sword arm. Usually I leave this off, but since the Scythes of the Emperor are a very codex compliant chapter, I feel like they would wear the armor in exactly the right configuration. I used some small balls of green stuff under the shoulders to get them posed exactly how I wanted. Now, the Scythes of the Emperor are successors to the Ultramarines, but the story is a little sketchier than that. It all started with Imperium Secundus. During the Horus Heresy, the Loyalists lost contact with Terra and the Emperor, and so in desperation, they started a second Imperium of Man. Now, this maybe seemed like a good idea at the time, but what ended up happening is it led to a lot of the Loyalists not being available to help defend Terra during the Siege of Terra and protect the Emperor. It's kind of a dark mark on the Loyalist Space Marine chapters. It wasn't a good look. Now, that was bad enough, but when it was time to break the Space Marine legions into 1,000 Marine chapters so that the Horus Heresy could never happen again, the protogenitors of the Scythes of the Emperor, these Marines got folded into Guilliman's chapter, the Ultramarines. And it kind of swelled his chapter greater than 1,000 Battle Brothers. They were kind of a ghost 11th company, which is not allowed. There's 10 companies to a Space Marine chapter, and these guys were kind of sort of the 11th chapter. Also not very good. Considering it was Guilliman's idea to limit Space Marine chapters to 1,000 Battle Brothers, and then immediately his chapter is the one to break that rule, not a great look, and it brought another stain to the Scythes of the Emperor, but eventually these guys would emerge as the Scythes of the Emperor, their own distinct chapter. A chapter with a checkered past, but a Loyalist chapter nonetheless. These Marines might have a sketchy past, but in practice, they are loyalist through and through. And honestly, the best Space Marine chapters are the ones that have some skeletons in their closet. To get my base ready for my little scythe, I took some ultra-thin super glue down on a base and loaded it up with some 1/4 inch cork. I tore off the excess and trimmed it up with my fingers. Then I grabbed some basing bits. These are our Grim Battlefield basing bits, bricks and stone, available at EonsOfBattle.com. I glued these down over the cork, sinking them into the cork so my Marine has a nice spot to stand, and then I added another piece of junk off to the side. I loaded up my Marine's feet with some thick super glue and crushed them down. Then I sprinkled on some small pebbles and sand, letting this pool up, and I dripped some ultra thin super glue over top to lock it down. I took some poster putty and stuck it into his neck hole and on his back where the backpack is gonna go to keep these parts free of paint, and now he's ready for our prime. The color scheme for the sides of the Emperor is black and yellow, but I want a grim dark black and yellow, so I started off with a black prime. Then a zenithal of white ink from above. I like ink for this, but it tends to be a little fragile, so I sprayed him with some satin varnish to protect this layer. Now for some color. I started out hitting his chest and crotch with some Imperial Fist's yellow contrast. This makes a really vibrant yellow, and I went back and forth on if his butt plates should be yellow or not. I can't find any images of size of the Emperor from behind, so I just decided to go for it. I put this on his backpack too. I really like the color this creates, but over the black, it looks a little sickly, so I went over these spots with some Eandon yellow. This is a more orange yellow to bring in some more saturation into the recesses. Then I took yellow opaque paint and started doing some highlights. This was mostly edge highlights and on his chest to make these spots brighter. Yellow is a color that works really well on Space Marines. It shows off their armor really well. I finished off this yellow with a sponging of warm white for paint chips, and all the yellow is done. A very easy series of steps, and the simplicity isn't done yet. I thinned down some black speed paint and glazed this over everywhere else, including his noggin. This did a really good job of giving me some nice black contrast, and next to the yellow, it looks even darker. I decided to make one of his knee pads in yellow, and now with the base coats applied, I can stick them all together, putting on his head and backpack. It's somewhat unusual for Space Marines to have different colors throughout their armor, but I think it looks really good. The size of the Emperor, being a successor chapter to the Ultramarines, I would bet they follow the Codex Astartes pretty rigidly. Now, a lot of chapters get their interest from not following the Codex Astartes, like the Space Wolves and the Black Templar, and there's some fun to be had there because then you can do anything you want, but there is some fun to be had by strictly following the rules. It lets you treat your Space Marines kind of like a historical war game where you can really know all the nitty-gritties about your characters. This isn't just a regular tactical Marine. This is a member of the 5th Company. He is the 69th member of the 5th Company. He's the 4th member of an assault squad. His chaplain's name is Dave, and his apothecary's name is Chevy. You can get really, really specific by following the hierarchies of the Codex Astartes. And you can also show that on the miniature. Looking through the Space Marine decal sheet, there is the symbol for Assault Doctrine, the crossed arrows, and this always goes on the left shoulder. And also the company number should also be shown on the left as well. I cut off the number 5 to show that he's a member of the 5th Company. I let these soak on my wet palette, my Masterson's wet palette, my favorite wet palette available at EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find merch like our EOB dice, wet palettes, waterslide decals, and facing toppers and bits. It's also the best way to support us with a membership. Each month, members get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. This August, we're dropping back into the world of fantasy with some deadly terrain, the Chaotic Cemetery Pack. A series of walls and sculptures depicting the haunting stillness of death and the brutal cruelness of chaos. Made in the shapes and sizes needed for games of Age of Sigmar Spearhead, Sand and Bone. These perilous walls are surrounded by a set of chaotic statues in the Icon of Change, the Likeness of War, the Bust of Decay, and the Effigy of Excess. The Chaotic Cemetery Pack was made by us and is available on our website as STL files or physically printed for you. After those symbols soaked, I transferred them to his shoulder pad using a wad of damp paper towel to really crush it down, getting rid of any trapped air and water so it sits perfectly flat. Then right in the center, I put a little Roman numeral V. This way, everyone knows what he's about. For his knee, I base coated this with some light gray paint, and then I painted in some white and did some black and white checkers. This symbol is the badge of the 5th Company. All 10 Space Marine companies have their own unique badge. And while I had the decal sheet out, I decided to throw on a campaign badge, a little sword in his ankle. He's all decked out in Codex-compliant heraldry. For his right shoulder pad, this is where the chapter symbol is displayed. For the size of the Emperor, it's the crossed sickles. I started out with putting a dot right in the center and then sketching 2 lines that intersect in this spot. The symbols of the sides isn't just awesome, it's actually a reference to the tools of the peasants who work on the agri-worlds that these Marines protect. It's nice to see some Space Marines actually taking some interest in the humans that they defend. Although in the sides case, all these farmers ended up being eaten by Tyranids, so yeah. I protected all these symbols with some squirts of satin varnish from the airbrush, and then to tint them a little to match the armor, I used some thinned down black speed paint. This stopped them from looking like perfect clean stickers. For the weapons, I went with some nice and simple warm black speed paints, glazed over the zenithal. This color has a little bit of brown in it, so it'll stand out nicely from the cold black of his armor. Once that dried, I gave these parts a dry brushing, making up a warm gray using some tan paint to match the hue of the speed paint, and I dry brushed this on, catching on all the little details. Then I took some silver paint and gave the weapons a light dusting to give them a little glitter, and I put this over the little skull on his chest as well. I picked out his eyes with a little red paint, and I would guess that 75% of all Space Marine chapters have red lenses. If I was putting together a force of Scythes of the Emperor, the unit that I would want to lean into to represent this army would probably be the Humble Assault Intercessor. These guys are not bad, and they're cheap as chips at 75 points for 5. The problem with these guys, Space Marines with chainswords, is they're kind of outclassed by every single combat unit that the Space Marines have, and the Space Marines have a lot. But that 75 points for 5 still makes them pretty intriguing. 150 points for 10 of these suckers is a lot of Space Marines to deal with, and Space Marines aren't that hard to deal with. But you attach a Librarian. Librarians are kind of funky, 55 points, dirt cheap, and they grant the squad 4-up invulnerable save. All of a sudden, these Space Marines are shrugging off 50% of the wounds allocated to them. That gets a little bit spicy because your opponent's gonna be like, all right, I see some Space Marines, I know how to deal with Space Marines, but all of a sudden, they're not dying. Which is kind of what Space Marines are meant to do. It's their armor of contempt, their oath of moment. They're supposed to be pretty darn tough. And 50-50, they ignore the hit. That's kind of tough. 3 big squads of 10 running around, throwing about 40 attacks with their chainswords, getting reroll hits with things like Oath of Moment, getting reroll wounds with the built-in special ability of the Assault Marines. Like, that can be a pretty devastating second wave of attack. You want something to soften up your opponent's army, because if you just charge in with a bunch of these guys, they will get clobbered. But if you use them right, I think that could provide a really, really nice baseline for your Space Marine army. The 4-up invulnerable save changes things a lot. Now, I have never had access to that 4-up invulnerable save because I would never take a Librarian. I'm a Black Templar player and we abhor the Witch. But if for some reason my models are painted black and yellow, it would be a-okay. Getting some paint on this guy's base, I want to try a rusty environment. So I started out slobbering on some brown, keeping this paint pretty wet so it'll flow off my brush into all the cracks and crevices. I also thinned this color way down and glazed it over his feet to make him feel more real, like he's been trekking through this landscape for a while. Then I took an orangey brown and dry brushed this over the base. This color is similar in hue to the brown, so it'll just add a little variety to the base without brightening or darkening it. To get some rust, I threw on some Dirty Down Rust, the rustiest rust west of the Rockies. When this dries, it makes for some very convincing rust, but it's not quite in scale. I need to add some small bright spots, and to do this, I took some off-white and sponged this on. The sponging creates a very different texture and only catches on the most raised areas. I only put on a little bit of this to add realism without brightening it up too much. The Scythes of the Emperor are a pretty brutal Space Marine chapter, and so I sponged some blood for the Blood God on the business end of his blade, and then I took some onto the end of a paintbrush and flicked it onto his chest, like he's just done a really good job hacking away at someone. Probably one of those Tyranids who ate his peasants. I gave the base a rim of glossy black, and then my Marine is ready for action. The Scythes of the Emperor. I don't know what it is about Space Marine armor, but it always looks really good in yellow. It's just really, really eye-catching and lets you see all of the little details and shapes that make up the Space Marine armor. These guys have a checkered past, but have proven themselves now to be a very loyal and powerful Space Marine chapter, and they're a successor chapter to the Ultramarines. I feel like these guys are a little cooler than the Ultramarines. I mean, Ultramarines are blue and they've got Mornius Calgar, but I mean black and yellow and covered in blood. These guys are the cool version of Codex Compliance. Let me know in the comments below what legion or chapter of Space Marine should I take a look at next. And as always, thanks for watching. And a big thanks to Tacticus for sponsoring the video. Click the link in the description to play today.